Morning Song. Come, dawn goes palely up the skies. O come from shadowed sleep, arise. For hark, our ousel thrills a call, warbling in the poplar tall, where slender herald breezes rouse, passing, murmuring to the boughs, the rainy voice of aspen leaves, and swallows twitter in the eaves. Come from thy silver dreams, arise. The hush and dimness of the night grows strange with creeping strands of light, and those pale mists that did enshroud coldly in a breathless cloud. The earth that greyly swathed lies like ghostly smoke along the skies. The coming sun will roll away and bid thee ope thine eyes of grey, and from thy golden dreaming rise. So, this is the first recorded poem presented in the collected poems of J.R.R. Tolkien, edited by Christina Scull and Wayne G. Hammond. Note, it is not the first poem he ever wrote. Tolkien's first poem had something to do with, in his words, a green great dragon. His mother told him it would have to be a great green dragon instead, and that's all Tolkien remembered about the work. But when it comes to Morning Song, we have a lot more information. In 1908, Tolkien met one Edith Bratt while the two were lodging in the same house in the Birmingham suburb of Edgbaston. The two fell in love within about a year. Tolkien was so enamored with her that his studies started to slip, and his guardian forbade him from seeing her until he was 21 years old. However, in 1910, 3 years before his 21st birthday, Tolkien was allowed to write Edith a letter, and in that letter he wrote the first draft of Morning Song, at first just called Morning. The final draft we see here is very concerned with sound and atmosphere, which makes sense, seeing as it's literally called a song. Just in the first stanza, we have the ousel warbling and thrilling its call, super fascinating verb choice by the way, then the rousing, murmuring breeze, the aspen leaves' rainy voice, and the swallows twittering, all of these things inviting the subject to arise, to wake up. The second stanza takes an interesting approach, going backwards from that starting point, explaining the hushed dimness of night that now goes away with the coming sun. And may I add, the words pale and creeping are such unique words to describe the dawn and strands of light. They feel kind of contrary to the tone of the piece's idea, unless the piece is actually trying to subvert the idea of dawn as welcoming, a contrast to the golden dreaming, but I'm not sure that's the case. Like, why would I want to wake from gold and silver dreams to a pale and creeping sun? It's also interesting that both dawn and the mists of night would each be described as pale. I showed this one to my patrons, and the consensus basically was that pale and creeping didn't have the same connotations for Tolkien as they might for us readers in the modern day. As one of my patrons said, with Tolkien's background as a philologist, he was interested in words in their purest forms, and we'll talk more about that in a second. The final version included in the collected works is the 5th draft, but what's great about the collected works is that it shows every draft available. This is what the first draft of Morning Sun looked like. As Scull and Hammond point out, the poem's final version had more sophisticated imagery and vocabulary. Lo, the gloomy hush of night from the sun has taken flight was changed to the hush and dimness of the night grows strange with creeping strands of light. And I agree, those redrafted lines are both more unique and more pleasing in terms of phonics. Another notable change is the use of the word ousel as opposed to blackbird. I feel like even that one word choice is representative of Tolkien's philosophy when it comes to language and poetry. Even in Tolkien's time, the word ousel was archaic, but he was never one to shy away from that, was he? In fact, we see a lot of Tolkien's passions spring up in his poetry. Tolkien was, perhaps first and foremost, a linguist. That should be evident given all the languages he invented. When he was around 18 years old, he reportedly wrote a limerick in one of his invented languages called Nevbash. He was also quite fond of translation, perhaps his most famous being Beowulf. He actually claims he was kind of a poetry hater, but learned to love it through his studies of Greek and Latin. Tolkien was both an avid writer and reader, and his work demonstrates just as much. The man was prolific. The collected poems altogether are about 1,500 pages long. And granted, not all of that is pure poetry, a lot of it is commentary from the editors and references. Even before page 1, there's about 90 pages of introduction, and about 24 pages of that is just a timeline of Tolkien's life and poetry. All that is to say, I am not an expert on any of this. There is so much to know, and I will never know all of it. I don't think any of us will. So today I just want to take a brief look at Tolkien's poetry. Having read the first poem we have from him, let's take a look at 5 more across his writing life and see what we can learn. You'll notice that the first book of the completed poems encapsulates just 10 years, 1910 to 1919. Let's take a look at a piece in the middle of this period. In approximately 1915, Tolkien wrote Goblin Feet. I am off down the road where the fairy lanterns glowed, and the little pretty flittermice are flying. A slender band of grey, it runs creepily away, and the hedges and the grasses are a-sighing. The air is full of wings of the blundering beetle things that go droning by, a whirring and a humming. Oh, I hear the tiny horns of enchanted leprechauns, and the padding feet of many gnomes a-coming. Oh, the lights, oh, the gleams, oh, the little tinkling sounds, oh, the rustle of their noiseless little robes, oh, the echo of their feet, of their little happy feet, oh, their swinging lamps in little starlit globes. I must follow in their train, down the crooked fairy lane, where the coney rabbits long ago have gone, and where silverly they sing in a moving moonlit ring, all a-twinkling with the jewels they have on. They are fading round the turn where the glowworms palely burn, and the echo of their padding feet is dying. It is knocking at my heart. Let me go, oh let me start, for the little hours of magic are a-flying. Oh the warmth, oh the hum, oh the colors in the dark, oh the gauzy wings of golden honey flies, oh the music of their feet, of their dancing goblin feet, oh the magic, oh the sorrow when it dies. As the compilation says, this is the best known of Tolkien's early poems. It was the first of his writings to ever appear in a book, in fact. An early version of the poem appeared in Oxford Poetry 1915, which is certainly nothing to shake a stick at. It was later reprinted in Dora Owen's Book of Fairy Poetry. And speaking of fairy poetry, this poem is obviously indicative of some of Tolkien's preferred subject matter, even decades before Lord of the Rings. Allegedly, Tolkien also wrote this poem for Edith because she, quote, said that she liked spring and flowers and trees and little elfin people. But funnily enough, a letter from Tolkien to Edith suggests that Edith did not like the first stanza of the poem. Tolkien asked if the verses were too mothy and batty, noting that fairies could also be described in the same way. And on that note, Tolkien also told Edith that he was disappointed with how Goblin Feet appeared in the Oxford Anthology, even in the literal sense. Tolkien didn't like the small font over 2 pages and how the poem ended up with as much white space as text. And I mean, that's just so relatable. A writer is never truly satisfied, are they? And with that being the case, it's no wonder why he went on to revise it. But what's particularly funny about that is how this poem would eventually become Tolkien's most well-known from his early years, on top of being one of his first major successes. Even so, Tolkien went on to hate it, despite, or maybe because of, how many requests he would receive to include it in various anthologies. In 1971, he called the poem The Unhappy Little Thing, representing all that I came so soon after to fervently dislike, and that the poem could be buried forever. As Skull and Hammond point out, the poem does sort of betray Tolkien's later mythology in certain ways. The elves here are of diminutive size, and they're conflated with fairies, leprechauns, gnomes, and even goblins. But even if Tolkien grew to hate it, I feel it's not hard to see why people love it. While the first poem we looked at, Morning Song, definitely reads more like the poems you might read in high school at least, this one reads as more suitable for all ages. Like, there are some words that kids probably wouldn't get, but the sing-song quality of this piece is just perfect for early readers. If there's one thing Morning Song and Goblin Feet have in common, it would be Tolkien's clear command of rhythm. When discussing one of his later poems, Nyanink, Tolkien actually said the following: "These things were constructed deliberately to be personal and give private satisfaction, nor for scientific experiment, nor yet in expectation of any audience. A consequent weakness is therefore their tendency, too free as they were from cold exterior criticism, to be over-pretty, to be phonetically and semantically sentimental, while their bare meaning is probably trivial, not full of red blood or the heat of the world such as critics demand." Ergo, Tolkien is admitting that he was more concerned with sound, language, and musicality than he was with theme. But interestingly, with Goblin Feet, the theme feels apparent, universal, and timeless, even for children's poetry like the work of Shel Silverstein. The speaker in the poem has this apparent longing to enter a fantasy world, to escape, to imagine. And how sorrowful it is when that magic, that imagination, dies. As the speaker says at the beginning of the third stanza, I must follow in their train. How strong that compulsion is to return to innocence and wonder. And while the poem might not necessarily imply it, I would argue we always can, especially through work like Tolkien's. With that, let's move into part 2 of this brief dive. The second volume of the collected poems goes from 1919 to 1931. You probably don't need me to tell you this, but a lot of Tolkien's poetry exists within a broader context, usually mythologies that he invented. A great example would be The Lay of the Fall of Gondolin, conceived as part of the Book of Lost Tales, but that poem is about 170 lines long, so I will not read it in this video. A shorter example, relatively speaking, would be Light as Leaf on Lindentree, also originally conceived with the Book of Lost Tales in mind. For those unaware, the Book of Lost Tales is a collection of Tolkien's early writings that flesh out Middle-earth as it would eventually come to be. It was compiled and published by J.R.R. Tolkien's son, Christopher Tolkien. However, if you're a big Tolkien head and scholar, which I admittedly am not, you might know Light as Leaf on Lindentree as Song of Beren and Luthien, as included in Lord of the Rings. The first draft of this poem goes back to, as far as we can tell, 1925, and Tolkien continued revising it all the way up until 1954 when the first Lord of the Rings book was published. Here is the poem as it appears in the book, and brace yourself because it's still a good 72 lines long. The leaves were long, the grass was green, the hemlock umbels tall and fair, and in the glade a light was seen, of stars in shadow shimmering. Tinuviel was dancing there, to music of a pipe unseen, and light of stars was in her hair, and in her raiment glimmering. There Beren came from mountains cold, and lost he wandered under leaves, and where the elven river rolled he walked alone and sorrowing. He peered between the hemlock leaves, and saw in wonder flowers of gold, upon her mantle and her sleeves, and her hair like shadow following. He heard there oft the flying sound of feet as light as linden leaves, or music welling underground, in hidden hollows quavering. Now withered lay the hemlock sheaves, and one by one with sighing sound, whispering fell the beechen leaves, in the wintry woodland wavering. He sought her ever, wandering far, where leaves of years were thickly strewn, by light of moon and ray of star, in frost heavens shivering. Her mantle glinted in the moon, as on a hilltop high and far she danced, and at her feet was strewn a mist of silver quivering. When winter passed she came again, and her song released the sudden spring, like rising lark and falling rain and melted water bubbling. He saw the elven flowers spring about her feet and healed again. He longed by her to dance and sing upon the grass untroubling. Again she fled, but swift he came. Tinuviel, Tinuviel. He called her by her elvish name, and there she halted, listening. One moment stood she, and a spell his voice laid on her. Beren came, and doom fell on Tinuviel, that in his arms lay glistening. As Beren looked into her eyes within the shadows of her hair, the trembling starlight of the skies he saw there mirrored shimmering. Tinuviel the elven fair, immortal maiden, elven wise, about him cast her shadowy hair, and arms like silver glimmering. Long was the way that fate them bore, o'er stony mountains cold and grey, though halls of iron and darkling door, and woods of nightshade morrowless. The sundering seas between them lay, and yet at last they met once more, and long ago they passed away, in the forest singing, sorrowless. You may have noticed dancing as a common motif in Tolkien's poems. According to Skull and Hammond, this is in large part because Tolkien was inspired by his wife dancing in the glade near Ruse, thus becoming forever his Luthien Tinuviel. Granted, some of the dancing poems predate that alleged moment of inspiration, but even still I can imagine that Tolkien just loved to watch his wife dance in general, no? If not dance with her. But anyway, even with that very sweet piece of background in mind, I always find poems like this fascinating. Poems that have a context and a world unto themselves. As Skull and Hammond point out, though, a lot of people skip over the poetry sections in Tolkien's works. In some ways, I don't blame them. I understand the general population's average consensus on poetry, especially given the way it's usually taught in school. So truly, I get it. But at the risk of sounding pretentious, I also feel kind of bad for these people. They're missing something by skipping over these sections, even if it's something that's just rhythmic and pleasant to the ear. It's fun that right now we're experiencing the poem oppositely. We've removed it from the context of its broader narrative and only have the text itself, its own narrative, to analyze. Kind of neat, though, that even in the context of Lord of the Rings, the characters are pretty far removed from the events of the poem, especially the hobbits, who really have no connection to it whatsoever. Aragorn is the one who recites it to the hobbits, and he, at the very least, is singing of his own family history. The story of Tinuviel and Beren is most definitely a compelling one, a love that seems doomed and tragic but ends in singing sorrowless. And knowing that Tinuviel was in large part inspired by Tolkien's own wife, it's just really sweet. Even without that context, the poem is compelling and heartwarming. Now, moving on, I wanted to make sure to include at least one translated piece in this video. This poem is called Gawain's Leave-Taking. Now, lords and ladies, blithe and bold, to bless you here now am I bound. I thank you all 1,000-fold, and pray God save you whole and sound. Wherever you go, on grass or ground, may He you guide, that not you grieve. For friendship that I here have found, against my will, I take my leave. For friendship and for favours good, for meat and drink you heaped on me, the Lord that raised was on the rood, now keep you comely company. On sea or land, where'er you be, may He you guide, that not you grieve. Such fair delight you laid on me. Against my will I take my leave. Against my will, although I wend, I may not always tarry here, for everything must have an end, and even friends must part, I fear. But we, beloved, however dear, out of this world doth will us reave, and when we brought our beer, against our will we take our leave. Now good day to you, good men all, and good day to you, young and old, and good day to you, great and small, and gramercy 1,000-fold. If aught there were that dear ye hold, full fain I would the deed achieve. Now Christ you keep from sorrow's cold, for now at last I take my leave. Now, despite the poem's title, the original text of this poem actually has nothing to do with Gawain and the Green Knight. This is a translation of a poem called, in today's English, Against My Will I Take My Leave. It's interesting that Tolkien would retitle the poem, seeing as he was such a purist when it came to translation. Not only that, but this isn't even the full text of the original poem, just the first 3 stanzas and the last. Tolkien, prolific and obsessive as he was, unsurprisingly worked on a full translation of Gawain too. He was particularly interested in the West Midlands dialect of Middle English, as opposed to the London dialect that authors like Geoffrey Chaucer used. Part of me wonders if Gawain's leave-taking was meant to be part of his full translation of the Gawain tale, but I honestly kind of doubt it. Like I said, Tolkien was a real purist when it came to translation. To cite the man himself as quoted in the complete poems, Tolkien had 2 objects in mind when translating: to preserve the original meter and alliteration, without which translation is of little value except as a crib, and to exhibit in an intelligible modern edition the nobility and the courtesy of this poem by a poet to whom courtesy meant so much. Most critics of the time actually stood in stark contrast to Tolkien. They thought his diction, vocabulary, and staunchness in meter and word order would make the text feel too foreign to readers. Skull and Hammond argue that the foreignness of Tolkien's Gawain is part of the appeal, as it gives a glimpse into another era. I personally think there are a lot of schools of thought when it comes to translation, one of which certainly is to preserve the exactness of the text in the new language. However, I don't think that should be the only school of thought when it comes to translation. That's not to say that Tolkien's translation isn't valid or that these critics were right in their criticism. I don't think they were. But I do disagree wholeheartedly that a translation would be a crib or a piece of plagiarism if the translator decided to take certain liberties. Of course, we could go on about this at length. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. We can actually see Tolkien's philosophy reflected in Gawain's leave-taking. Look at the 2nd and 6th lines. To bless you here now am I bound, and may He you guide that not you grieve. These are likely products of the original word order and meter. If we were to write them more for clarity, we might instead write, to bless you here now I am bound, and may He guide you that not you grieve. The second rewrite changes the rhythm, but the first could have been preserved, even while using a word order we're much more familiar with. But with these thoughts in mind, it's kind of funny that Tolkien retitled Against My Will I Take My Leave to Gawain's leave-taking. Is that not in opposition to the author's original intent with the piece? However, it's hardly a wonder why Tolkien thought of Gawain when reading the poem. This translation was done at the same time Tolkien was in the midst of translating the Arthurian legend, so of course he had it on his mind already. As with the quote we read earlier, this may have just been a personal project for him, not for anyone else's eyes, and with no other object in mind than his own satisfaction. Christopher Tolkien ended up including this poem on the last page of Tolkien's translations of Gawain, Pearl, and Sir Orfeo. In Christopher's mind, this poem takes place just after Gawain leaves Bertilac's castle and goes to confront the Green Knight, knowing assuredly that he will die, and so the whole take my leave thing has a pretty obvious double meaning. Gawain is taking his leave from Bertilac's place, but also from the land of the living. The poem is quite straightforward otherwise. It's a blessing from one who's soon to die, and it's quite tender. With that, we're going to take a big jump and move into two of Tolkien's later works. By late 1963, Tolkien was in a tough place. His friend C.S. Lewis had just passed, his work was piling up, the effects of fame were only getting heavier, and changes in the Catholic Church weighed on him. Even with the smash hits of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien had to make significant edits to the American editions, all while facing immense pressure from his editor to finish the Silmarillion. All of this and more likely led to the composition of Though All Things Fail and Come to Naught. Though all things fail and come to naught, and all in vain is vainly wrought, though time's long lanes stretch lagging on, without a turn, till they are gone, and all things that must walk that way have nothing accomplished that shall stay or be remembered, since all thought is nothing of nothing unto naught. Even negation, neither night nor silence is, for voice and light no meaning have, when such an end is reached by all as some pretend. It seems solution truly fit for an unmeaning tangle knit, by naught for nothing, still 'tis hard, for one yet in the high walls barred, that pen time's wayfarers so straight, not to believe at least that hate, folly, and cruelty that beset all lanes with anguish or with fret, and misery, never mind the end, the way is needless, grim to wend, that these at least shall find a hell beyond oblivion, some fell, indelible imprint that will, when all is over, linger still. 'Tis hard indeed not to believe that endlessly without reprieve the dreadful ghost of what is done shall still pursued forever run, from the remorseless wraith unseen, the ghost of ghosts, the might have been. So this is a rough one, to say the least, an undeniable downer, but there's something important to note here. While the poem certainly is about the despair in death and the eventual death of all things and people, that's just the surface layer reading. The more we read, and once we get to the end especially, we understand that the poem is less about death and more about regret. It is regret that makes death so painful. Notice that the speaker contradicts themselves in this poem. At first, they say that all things will eventually end, come to naught, and have no presence, and that includes negation. Voice and silence will both be forgotten, as will light and night. But later in the poem, the speaker says that hate, folly, and cruelty will linger still. The poem truly puts us into the mind of someone who is without hope, stuck in the idea that all things that are good will end, while all things that are bad will, in some way, go on. But believe it or not, and whether it was intended or not, there is a small sense of hope in this poem. The piece ends with the ghost of what is done being pursued by the wraith of what might have been. So logically, if we never ask ourselves what might have been, there will be no chase. It's certainly a very human thing to wonder about how things could be different, and I'm certainly not saying we shouldn't fight for a better status quo, but on the personal level, we can either regret our decisions or we can live with them and try to make better ones going forward. And if feelings like hate can persist despite the hell they find, maybe there's a way for love to go on beyond the grave too. And that'll take us into the last poem of this video. At last the time has come, he said. At last the time has come, he said, when we are all at sea, while you are baking gingerbread and I am boiling tea. The world will soon be 9 days old and near the end of wonder, and all the surface will be sold for songs or something under. Then where will little Billy sit and keep his feet from frost, while Uncle makes a song of it and counts the bitter cost? Right here, then Billy cried, my feet are in the flame. Though over me flow time and tide, I still shall keep my name. I still shall bake or dream I bake for you the Pandemane. Though sea may roar and earth may quake, you will not cry in vain. Skull and Hammond suggest this poem brings to mind Lewis Carroll's The Walrus and the Carpenter. The poems do share some words, but otherwise they just share a similar meter, and a lot of poems are written in common meter like this: iambic tetrameter in the first line, iambic trimeter in the second line, and so on. You'll recognize that same pattern in Emily Dickinson's poems and in songs like Amazing Grace, I'd Like to Buy the World a Coke, and the Pokemon theme song. Anyway, with structure still in our minds, this poem actually kind of feels like the spiritual response to Though All Things Fail and Come to Naught. The organization here is peculiar. The poem is framed as a conversation between two people, the titular he and Billy. We don't know the relationship between the two, but it's possibly familial given the reference to uncle as if he's a shared family member. But regardless, the poem is basically a call and response. 12 lines of one speaker turned on their head by a volta and 8 lines of the second speaker. The first speaker is pure pessimism. He acknowledges that there is presently baking of gingerbread and boiling tea, but soon things will go to pot. The world will be 9 days old, hearkening back to the phrase 9 days wonder used by Chaucer and many other authors. It's a phrase referring to a passing phenomenon. But without having known that on my first reading, I figured 9 days old might have been a biblical allusion. Like the world was created in 7 days, so by the 9th day there was really nothing to see, nothing more to it, nothing unique. And I'll emphasize, I really don't think that's the intended meaning, but still I thought it was kind of a fun way of making sense of the phrase. Then the speaker says the surface of the world will be sold for songs or something under, that is, for trivialities. In that sense, it's not hard to read the piece as an environmentalist poem. The surface of the world truly has been sold, hasn't it? And with all that surface taken, where will Billy have room to sit? Even Uncle will ultimately reduce it all to triviality, writing a song. What other option would he have? But Billy stands firmly in opposition to the first speaker's pessimism. Billy sees a place to sit and he will stay there. Even as time and tide flow over him, he will keep his name, and that is enough for him. He even says that the dream of baking alone will be enough for him, even if he can't actually bake. How can you not love this resolve? It's easy to call it naivete for sure, but the need for this kind of hope is so important now more than ever. I feel this resolve is what makes us human. We live. We are resilient. Sometimes all we need to keep going is the dream that we will keep going. The world might not be where we want it to be right now, but we can't stop hoping for a better one. And ultimately, isn't that idea of hope kind of the driving force in Tolkien's works? I feel that if there's anything to take away from this video, it would be the things that make Tolkien a great writer. Certainly his love of language, his obsession with it, didn't hurt at all. But also, love in general, I think, was the thrust of his work. He loved people, like his wife and C.S. Lewis. He loved life at large. It reminds me of this quote from Mary Oliver. The poet must not only write the poem, but must scrutinize the world intensely, or anyway that part of the world he or she has taken for subject. If the poem is thin, it is likely so not because the poet does not know enough words, but because he or she has not stood long enough among the flowers, has not seen them in any fresh, exciting, and valid way. Tolkien was a man who certainly spent time in the flowers. That much feels clear in his work. And for all the words he knew, all the language he studied, it was ultimately the power of his emotions that made his work great. Granted, remember that emotion alone won't carry a piece. Tolkien, for all his faults, truly was a genius, and even his earliest poems make that apparent. And the crazy thing is that we can become like him, like all great poets and writers of this world, who bake and boil tea and dream. But what do you think? Did you enjoy the poems presented here? What are your thoughts on these pieces and Tolkien's poetry at large? Did your thoughts differ from mine? Do you disagree with my conclusions? Please tell me everything. And hey, before you go, take a look at this poem. This is a piece from one of my patrons, Odi Dalpra. Street City. A chill and wrinkled city street whose lights wink tungsten gold against night's starless cloak. Spew single-file cars, eyes piercing white, with Doppler purrs that hail their muffler smoke. We our people teeming pass us by, betrothed to graveyard shifts they carry on. Past fault-line sidewalks, spotlights rake the sky, off bespoke spires, the urban paragon. I stayed the night to talk with you, but now, with all polite pretense closed with the bar, we savor every powdered breath aloud, us early morning strangers from afar. You meet my car, my place, my bed, and then I make you promise you'll be back again. For the chance to submit your work at the end of one of my videos, or if you just like what I do here and want to support, you can consider donating to my Patreon too. For as little as $3 a month, you can see videos early, hear about the books I'm reading each month, and join the community Discord, wherein we do open mics and writing prompts. Our first prompt of April was to use 2 concrete images with a seasonal volta between them to express an abstract emotion. It was a ton of fun. You're seeing my patrons' names on screen right now, and as usual, I can never thank them enough. If you want to support in other important ways, doing all the algorithm stuff really does help. Liking, commenting, subscribing, hyping, going down fairy lantern roads, that sort of thing. You can follow me on my socials if you want, but no matter what, keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately keep in mind, this is a rough draft. And for sticking around till the end, have a writing prompt. For this week's prompt, I want you to write a poem that serves as a legend in a fictional world. It can be a world you've already created, perhaps for a novel you're working on, or it can be a world of your own invention right now. You can borrow tropes from Tolkien, or you can make it wholly your own. It's all in your hands. You also have a lot of flexibility here in terms of form. Feel free to make it free verse if you want to, or you can make it rhyme like Tolkien's works. But in any case, the time is now yours. Get to writing.